Should you work with frozen cake layers, room temperature cake layers, fridge cake layers? What in the world? Now, obviously, I don't know everything there is to know, but what I can tell you is what I do and what I've learned and what my experiences are. You can work with room temperature cake layers. You can work with frozen cake layers. You can work with chilled cake layers. You can work with partially frozen cake layers. My favorite thing to do is to work with room temperature cake layers. And this is because when you're stacking it and building it, you know exactly what the cake is going to look like, how it's going to settle, and stuff like that. But the only problem with doing this is that the cakes are not cold. So once you're building your cake up, it's not going to set that buttercream. The buttercream is going to remain very, very soft. And that makes the cake really like wobbly, and it's not that stable, and it can get quite difficult to get a nice smooth crumb coat on it because it's wibble wobbling all over the place. So I like to work with cakes that have been chilled in the freezer for about 30 minutes to an hour. What I usually do is I will bake all my cake layers the night before, and then I will just wrap them up in a few layers of plastic wrap, and I'll just leave them on the counter. And the next morning, I'll throw them all in the freezer, and I'll get busy making frosting and fillings and all of that stuff. And by the time I'm ready, they've been nice and chilled. So when you're working with cakes that have been chilled, as you're stacking and building your cake, it's going to set that buttercream and it's going to kind of lock it in place. So you get a lot more stability when you're adding your crumb coat, which makes it a ton easier to work with your cake. You can also work with completely frozen cakes. You can bake them, wrap them in plastic wrap, and toss them in the freezer for several days, up to even a few months, some people say. But in my personal experience, I like to do no more than 1 to 2 weeks because I feel like it kind of loses a little bit of its freshness and texture when it's in the freezer for too long. And when you're working with completely frozen cakes, it makes it a ton easier to stack and crumb coat them, especially if you're adding a filling. But one thing I will mention, when you are working with frozen cake layers, as that cake warms up and it starts settling into itself, it can move and shift, and you can get bulges in your frosting after you've added that crumb coat and final coat of icing. So what I like to do when I'm working with cakes that are completely frozen is I will stack it and crumb coat it, and I will set it aside on the counter while I work on my other orders. And that will allow it to come to room temperature a little bit and defrost a little bit, and it'll settle, and it might bulge, it might bubble, it might do whatever it's going to do. And then I can fix all of those things. And then I see sometimes it'll start sagging on one side and not the other. So I